Ever feel like history is just one giant game of what if? Well, get ready to unpack a moment when those what ifs could have rewritten the entire world map, because today's deep dive throws us right into the heart of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Oh, absolutely.
We're talking nuclear brinkmanship, high-stakes negotiations, and enough tension to power a small city.
Yeah.
You sent over some really fascinating material about it all, so let's see what's got you hooked this time.
What always gets me about the Cuban Missile Crisis is how this wasn't just a sudden storm, like those historical flashpoints we imagine. It's more like a chain reaction, where seemingly small choices had these massive ripple effects, eventually pushing the US and the Soviet Union dangerously close to a conflict neither could truly win.
I love that you call it a chain reaction, especially because in the research you shared, the idea of the butterfly effect kept popping up.
Right.
This whole notion that a butterfly flapping its wings in Brazil could set off a hurricane in Florida, it feels weirdly fitting for this story, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. We often look at huge events in history and assume there was this inevitable path leading up to them. But the butterfly effect, it's a reminder that even minor decisions, seemingly insignificant at the time, can spiral out in ways no one could have predicted. The Cuban Missile Crisis is a perfect example of that.
So where do these butterfly wings even begin to flap for something as massive as the Cuban Missile Crisis? It seems like we have to start with the Cold War itself, right? That ever-present tension between the US and the Soviet Union, each side convinced the other was about to make a power play.
You can't disentangle the Cuban Missile Crisis from the Cold War context, that's for sure. Everything was already so volatile, the constant threat of nuclear war, the arms race, the dominant theory suggesting that if one country fell to communism, others would quickly follow. It created this incredibly precarious global landscape, primed for things to escalate quickly.
And right smack in the middle of this already tense global standoff, you have the Cuban Revolution in 1959. Fidel Castro comes to power, aligns himself with the Soviets, and suddenly it's like someone threw gasoline on a bonfire, wouldn't you say?
That's a great analogy, because the U.S. saw Castro's communist government as a direct threat almost in their backyard and reacted accordingly. Meanwhile, the Soviets saw an opportunity to expand their influence and gain a strategic foothold in the Western Hemisphere. You have this combustible mix of ideology, ambition, and opportunity, a recipe for disaster.
And that brings us, perhaps inevitably, to the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. But we're talking about the butterfly effect and unintended consequences. This has to be Exhibit A.
It really is a textbook example. This U.S.-backed attempt to overthrow Castro, it was an unmitigated disaster. Not only was it a tactical failure, but it also had the opposite effect of what was intended, pushing Castro even closer to Khrushchev and the Soviets.
Almost like trying to put out a fire with gasoline, wouldn't you say? Instead of weakening Castro, it strengthened his resolve and pushed him further into the Soviet camp. It's no wonder that after the Bay of Pigs, Castro began pushing Khrushchev even harder for serious military support.
And you can understand why Castro felt so vulnerable. He knew the U.S. still considered him a threat, and he needed a way to guarantee his own security and the security of his regime.
Meanwhile, Khrushchev was facing his own set of pressures. The U.S. had missiles in Turkey and Italy, which must have felt like daggers pointed at the heart of the Soviet Union. Putting Soviet missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, must have seemed like the ultimate power move, a way to finally level the playing field.
Exactly. Khrushchev likely saw it as a calculated risk, a bold move to counter what he perceived as American aggression. Of course, it was an incredibly dangerous gamble, one that could have easily backfired, as we know it almost did.
And here's where our chain reaction kicks into overdrive. You have John F. Kennedy, a relatively new president, already dealing with the fallout from the Bay of Pigs debacle. Suddenly, he's facing photographic evidence of Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba. It's hard to even imagine the kind of pressure he must have been under.
It's difficult to overstate the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just a political crisis, it was a moment of existential threat. And importantly, Kennedy recognized this wasn't a decision he could or should make alone. This is where ExComm comes in, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, assembled to advise him on how to respond. And by all accounts, those meetings were incredibly tense.
I bet. So picture this. They're in the war room, facing this horrifying dilemma. What were the options on the table at that point, and what made each one so terrifying?
Well, some advisors were pushing for immediate military action. Airstrikes on the missile sites were on the table. And some even argued for a full-scale invasion of Cuba. Imagine that a ground war in Cuba, potentially escalating to a nuclear exchange. The tension must have been palpable in that room.
It's hard to even fathom. On the one hand, you have the very real threat of Soviet missiles just miles from your shores. But on the other hand, launching a preemptive strike could easily spiral into a full-blown nuclear war. It's almost impossible to imagine having to weigh those options.
It really is, and it's a testament to Kennedy and his advisors that they were able to think so strategically under that kind of pressure. Ultimately, they recognized that direct military action was just too risky, too likely to provoke a catastrophic response from the Soviets.
So airstrikes and a full-scale invasion were off the table, but doing nothing, just letting the Soviets keep their missiles in Cuba, that wasn't really an option either, right? Wouldn't that make the U.S. look weak and embolden Khrushchev even further?
You're absolutely right. Inaction would have been interpreted as weakness, not just by the Soviets, but by other nations watching this standoff unfold. It could have emboldened other communist movements and upset the delicate balance of power during the Cold War. Kennedy needed to find another way.
And that's where the idea of a naval blockade comes in. I remember reading about this in school, how they called it a quarantine instead of a blockade, which I guess sounds a little less aggressive.
Exactly. They called it a quarantine to try and avoid the implication that this was an act of war. The idea was to prevent further Soviet shipments to Cuba, essentially putting a stranglehold on the island to force Khrushchev to negotiate. It was a high-stakes gamble, a way to apply pressure without resorting to immediate military action.
It must have felt like the entire world was holding its breath during those tense days, knowing that a single miscalculation, a single spark, could ignite a global conflict. And then, just when you think things couldn't get any tenser, you have Black Saturday, October 27, 1962.
A chilling day indeed. This was the day a U.S. reconnaissance plane, a U-2, was shot down over Cuba, killing the pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson. Imagine the shockwaves that this sent through Washington.
Talk about a gut punch. You're already walking on eggshells trying to avert a nuclear apocalypse, and then this happens. It must have felt like the fuse was lit. How did Kennedy and ExComm even begin to process that kind of blow?
It was a critical turning point. Many within ExComm understandably saw this as an act of aggression that demanded a swift and decisive response. Calls for immediate retaliatory airstrikes intensified, with some arguing that the Soviet Union had essentially forced America's hand.
I can't imagine the weight of that decision resting on Kennedy's shoulders. To resist that urge to retaliate, to remain calm and rational when everything seems to be spiraling out of control, it's almost superhuman. How did he manage to hold back?
It's a question historians still debate to this day. What we do know is that while all of this was happening very publicly, secret back-channel negotiations were also taking place between Kennedy and Khrushchev. It seems both men, despite the immense pressure they were under, understood that a direct conflict could have no winners.
So while the world watched with bated breath, behind the scenes, these two leaders were trying to find a way out of the maze they'd built. It's incredible to think that diplomacy was still possible at that point, with tensions running so high. How did they even begin to bridge that gap?
It was a delicate dance, for sure. Publicly, Khrushchev sent mixed signals, issuing ultimatums one day and then hinting at compromise the next. Behind the scenes, however, things were a bit clearer. Khrushchev, in a message to Kennedy, proposed a deal. He would remove the Soviet missiles from Cuba if the U.S. pledged not to invade the island.
Which, from Castro's perspective, had always been his main concern, right? To ensure his own safety and the survival of his regime. But was that enough for Kennedy? It seems like a big concession to make without getting anything in return.
You're right to point that out, and this is where the negotiations get really interesting, because there was another, less publicized part of the deal. The U.S. also secretly agreed to remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey.
So it was a bit of a quid pro quo. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours.
In essence, yes. The U.S. was very insistent that the removal of their Turkish missiles was not officially linked to the agreement about Cuba. They wanted to maintain the image of strength to avoid any perception that they were backing down to Soviet demands.
Image is everything on the world stage, especially during the Cold War, I imagine. But at the end of the day, both sides agreed to remove their missiles. The crisis was averted, at least for the time being. But I imagine it didn't feel like a clear-cut victory for either side, did it?
You're right. There were no parades, no triumphant speeches. Both Kennedy and Khrushchev faced criticism at home for their handling of the situation. Kennedy for making any concessions to the Soviets at all, and Khrushchev for appearing weak, for blinking first in this deadly standoff.
It makes you wonder, though, what was going through their minds when they finally stepped back from the brink. What lessons did they learn from those 13 days that pushed the world to the edge of annihilation?
It's like they say, sometimes you don't make peace with your friends, you make it with your enemies.
Isn't that the truth? And I think in this case, staring into the abyss of nuclear war. It forced both sides to confront just how high the stakes really were. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a wake-up call, a stark reminder that communication, real, meaningful communication, was essential to avoid a conflict that neither side could truly win.
Yeah.
And that's where this whole red phone idea comes in, right?
Yeah.
That iconic image of a direct line between the White House and the Kremlin so the leaders could talk without delay if things started heating up again.
It might sound like something out of a movie, but that's exactly what happened. The Moscow-Washington Hotline, as it was officially called, was a direct result of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Both sides realized that relying on diplomatic cables and ambassadors with all the potential for delays and misunderstandings just wasn't enough. They needed a way to cut through the bureaucracy and talk leader to leader in a crisis.
And to think something as simple as a dedicated phone line probably did more to prevent nuclear war than any treaty or weapon system ever could.
It's a fascinating example of how sometimes the most effective solutions aren't about military might or technological superiority, but about communication and building trust, even if it's just a sliver of trust between adversaries.
It really makes you appreciate the power of clear communication, especially when the fate of the world is hanging in the balance. But the hotline wasn't the only lasting impact of the Cuban Missile Crisis, was it? Didn't this whole experience pave the way for other agreements aimed at reducing the risk of nuclear war?
Absolutely. The Cuban Missile Crisis served as a catalyst for the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in 1963, which banned nuclear weapon tests in the atmosphere, underwater, and outer space. Again, we see this pattern of the crisis forcing both sides to acknowledge the very real dangers of escalation and pushing them, however reluctantly, toward finding ways to coexist to manage this terrifying new world they'd created.
So what does this all mean for someone listening today, decades removed from the anxieties of the Cold War? I mean, it's fascinating history, but those anxieties feel like a distant memory now.
You'd be surprised how relevant the lessons of the Cuban Missile Crisis remain, even in our very different world. On the surface, it might seem like a relic of a bygone era, but at its heart, it's a story about the choices we make, individually and collectively, and the unintended consequences that can spiral out in ways we never imagined.
It's a reminder that even when we think we have everything under control, the situation can change in an instant. It's about the importance of clear communication, of empathy, of trying to understand the other side's perspective, even when we vehemently disagree with them.
Precisely. It reminds us that history isn't just a collection of dates and events. It's a reflection of who we are, how we respond to crisis, and how those responses shape the world we live in.
And sometimes it's those moments when we're forced to confront our own mortality, when the stakes are at their highest, that we discover the best versions of ourselves. The Cuban Missile Crisis, for all its terror and uncertainty, also revealed a capacity for restraint, for dialogue, for finding a way out of the darkness.
That's a powerful way to put it. And perhaps that's the most important takeaway from this whole deep dive. It's a reminder that even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds, hope and human connection can prevail.
It's a reminder that we have a choice always to choose dialogue over destruction, understanding over ignorance, and to remember that even in the darkest of times, there's always a glimmer of light, a chance to find a better way forward. Which brings us to the question you posed at the start of our deep dive, the one about seeing things from Castro's perspective.
Ah, yes. Castro, the leader of a relatively small nation, caught in the middle of a superpower standoff, facing the very real possibility of being wiped off the map, not by his own choices, but by the choices of others. It's a sobering thought.
It really is. It forces us to ask, how much agency do smaller nations really have in a world still dominated by superpowers? What are the unintended consequences of alliances? And how do we navigate those complex geopolitical realities without becoming pawns in a larger game?
These are questions with no easy answers, but they're questions worth grappling with nonetheless. And perhaps that's the most fitting ending to our deep dive into the Cuban Missile Crisis. We're left not with definitive answers, but with a deeper understanding of the complexities, the nuances, and the enduring relevance of this pivotal moment in human history.
So to our listener out there, we leave you with this image. Fidel Castro, cigar in hand, staring out at the Caribbean Sea, caught between two superpowers on the brink of war. What was he thinking? What choices did he make, and what choices were made for him? And ultimately, what does his experience teach us about the delicate balance of power in our world? Keep those questions in mind, and until next time, happy diving.